அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். உங்களுக்கு தெரியும், தமிழ் சிவிக் ஆக்ஷன் அமைப்பு மூலமாக நாங்கள் மகாகவி பாரதி அவர்களின் நினைவுகளை கனடாவிலே நினைவு கூறும் வண்ணத்தில் பாரதி பூங்கா என்ற ஒரு பூங்கா அமைப்பதற்கான திட்டத்தை முன்னெடுத்து செய்து வருகின்றோம். பாரதியின் நினைவு நாள் 100வது ஆண்டு நெருங்கி வருகின்ற இந்த வேளையிலே பல்வேறு விதமான முயற்சிகள் புலம்பெயர்ந்த சமூகமாக நாங்கள் எடுத்திருக்கின்றோம். இந்த வேளையில ஒரு சிறப்பு விருந்தினர் ஒருவரை சந்திப்பது மிக முக்கியமாக உங்களுடன் அவரை பற்றிய விடயங்களை அவர் மூலமாக பகிர்ந்து கொள்வதற்கு மிகவும் மகிழ்வாக இருக்கின்றது. அந்த வகையில் அவரை இப்பொழுது உங்களுக்கு அறிமுகப்படுத்துகின்றோம். Good evening, Professor Mira Sundarajan. For those who are watching, Professor Mira Sundarajan is the great-granddaughter of Bharati, Mahakavi Bharathiyar. So it's an honor that we are able to connect with you. It's very rare to find a relative of Bharati in the North American context, and also to be able to be in a position to be able to have a conversation. So I'm very thrilled and a bit nervous as well, as you can see. But I think, Professor Mira, we wanted to talk to you both because you're related to Bharati and Mahakavi Bharathiyar, but also more importantly, the work that you're doing that is also connected to the legacy of Bharati. So let's start with maybe getting a sense of being a great-granddaughter of such a great poet and such a revolutionary poet and such a person who was more advanced for his time in many, many ways. And within a very short lifespan of less than 4 decades, had contributed so much to the Tamil literature, Tamil's way of thinking, not only Tamils, but to a large extent to India and also internationally. So I want to hear from you what it feels like to be a person that is related to Mahakavi Bharathiyar and how your life has been shaped by his, the fact that you are, somebody who can trace back your heritage to someone so great and powerful as Mahakavi Bharathiyar.
Thank you so much, Nathan. It's such a great pleasure for me to be part of this interview today. And actually the honor is entirely mine to be able to talk about my great-grandfather, this great personality, especially with this occasion of his 100th death anniversary approaching, which provides us with the chance to reflect upon him and his legacy that we may not otherwise have in quite the same way. So growing up as a great-granddaughter of Bharati is a very interesting experience to tell you about because for our family, the legacy of Mahakavi is very important. It's fundamental to our identity in every way. And this is particularly the case, I think, in our branch of the family, because my mother, of course, was Bharati's granddaughter. So she's the daughter of Bharati's elder daughter. The poet had 2 daughters. And as a result, she was brought up by her grandmother, so the poet's wife, and her mother, the poet's daughter. But then she went on to take a research interest in Bharati's work, and she became a scholar specializing in his work. In fact, she was one of the first people to draw attention to the importance of that literary legacy from a literary criticism point of view. And so we had a sort of double interest, therefore, in our family. First of all, this was our grandfather, our ancestor. And of course, we look up to our elders and our ancestors. But then in addition, he had this important literary legacy that my mother had been part of the process of bringing out and studying. So in that sense, I know about Bharati from the time I was born. In fact, I have a funny anecdote about that because my mother was a wonderful singer. And she was actually trained in the tradition of Bharati's songs by her grandmother and her mother. They learned Bharati's poems from the poet himself. So the family has a unique way of singing the songs that go back to the poet's own training. So she used to sing those songs to me from the time I was born. So when I was a small baby and so on, she would sing them to me and try to put me to sleep. And apparently as a baby, I used to close my eyes and pretend to sleep. And then when she would stop singing, I would immediately open my eyes and expect her to continue singing. So in a sense that my enthusiasm for the poet was born, at that very early stage of my life. And, more importantly, the reading Bharati's work was something that was fundamental to my mother's development. And so my father as well was a great reader of Bharati, although he was an English scholar by training himself. And in fact, one of the important reasons he married my mother was because of her connection to the poet. So everything in our household was directed by their reading of the poet's life. All of the values that they believed in, the way they organized their life, the way they brought me up, what they taught me as a female, as a daughter, that I should be aspiring for in my life was very much directed by the poet's writings, because of course the poet was a great feminist. And so I simply wouldn't exist or be the person that I am today without that background. That's how fundamental it was. I'll say one more thing about that, which may be particularly interesting to your viewers, which is, I was born in Vancouver, and my parents, when I was a small child, moved to Saskatoon so that my father could continue with his English studies. And so we were in a very interesting situation there, because there wasn't a big Indian population in those days. I'm talking about the 70s, 80s, early 80s. And so we were one of 3 or 4 South Indian families in the entire city. So there was an interesting dichotomy there, because we had this family history that was so important to us, that really defined all of us as people. And yet he was not broadly known in the community outside us. So that was an interesting tension or contrast. And it was only later, when I started traveling to India regularly, my parents at one point quit Saskatoon and took a whole year when they traveled, and we went to Singapore, to India, to Australia as well. And at that time, I got involved in various activities, watched my mother and father participating in activities related to Bhakti, and I started to understand that, there was a community of people that was profoundly influenced by him. And not only influenced by him, but that they had developed a tremendous love towards the poet. So the love that we had as grandchildren and so on, they had it as his readers. And it was a very moving and humbling thing to discover that, and a very wonderful experience.
Yeah, and definitely. I mean, one of the things that we have no difficulty in is to try to engage young people with his work comes so naturally. It's not stuck in any form of a time period that the next generation can't comprehend or connect to. And in fact, when we do events on Bharati, there's so much different types of creativity that comes through, because his content is so much the foundation of creative thinking in all forms and all different topics that could be covered through it. And our young artists, find multiple ways to express themselves through the foundation of his work. So it wasn't a difficult thing. Sometimes some of the other texts are very treasured in the Tamil community as well, but it is hard to engage generation after generation. But this one, his work in particular, has been a form of unifying force as well for Tamil community across multiple continents, also across multiple generations, which is a great thing. You started talking a little bit about the work your mother had done, and I had the privilege and the honor to be on a call to have conversation with her, and was inspired by the amount of time and her in her life that she dedicated towards telling the authenticity of sharing the authenticity, and also making sure that this particular history of documentation that was necessary, because not everything completely got documented during Bharati's lifetime, and a lot of the work was left behind to be documented and shared, and she had done a lot of those works. Can you tell us a little bit more about the actual details of the work that she was able to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So she started studying Bharati as a PhD student. And in fact, she was the first person to write a PhD on Bharati's literary legacy. And she wrote a fascinating thesis, because it was about the multiple aspects of the poet's personality. So each chapter dealt with one aspect of his contribution, nationalism, philosophical writings, and so on. And she basically, she made a series of contributions, her thesis being the first one, where she talked about both his biography and his work, the interpretation of his work. But then she also later on became preoccupied with the idea of establishing an edition of his work. And it's a curious thing, as you rightly point out, just thinking back to Bharati's times, that was a time when India was still under the colonial government, and it was a time of struggle. And also the foundation hadn't been laid very well in India for a scholarly tradition to develop in terms of preserving texts and maintaining their authenticity and so on. So what my mom had seen happening over a period of decades was a gradual deterioration in that area, and as we moved further and further away in time from the poet himself, she became greatly preoccupied with the issue of preserving authenticity, as you say. And so one of her objectives was to create an edition where she could definitely include the poetry that he had written. So first of all, just his poetry, not other people's poetry, and also not leaving out any of his important works. And at the same time, establishing the text of those works. So very, fundamental work that a literary scholar needs to do to say, okay, here's what Bharati actually did in his life. Here are the words that he actually said. Let's make sure that there's no ambiguity about that. So one of her important efforts was to maintain and develop this idea of a standard edition of his poems. And she completed that in her lifetime. Actually, she was in her 70s when she completed that work and established all of his poetry in 4 volumes. And she had planned to do his prose as well, which would have been another 7 volumes of work. And she started that, but unfortunately, she passed away before she could complete that work. So hopefully there will be some other means by which the poet's legacy gets preserved in that regard. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
I guess I'll say one more thing about that too, because my mother was preoccupied about 2 things. One was that the work should be preserved intact. But secondly, she was also concerned that the story of the poet should be preserved so that the authentic facts of his life, his attitudes, the incidents of his life that were important, all of those should be known to people, and they should be known in a truthful form. And this was a very deep preoccupation of hers, because going back to her grandmother's time, so after Bharatiyar died, then of course his wife was left with the task of trying to figure out what to do essentially about him and his legacy. He was no longer there physically. And, she had struggled a lot. And because there wasn't a proper tradition of documenting the lives of important people at that time, partly because of the national oppression that was underway, a situation arose where a lot of false stories developed, legends developed, and not all of them out of any kind of malicious intent. In a lot of cases, people, because of their very love for the poet, they developed stories or ideas or associations, but they were not grounded in fact, or they were not verifiable. Mm-hmm. And so her concern was that the true personality of the poet would simply disappear behind all of these stories. And that concern had started to be a situation even in her grandmother's time, and then, her mother's time, and then her time. So she felt that some action needed to be taken about that. So that's another important contribution that she did. She established his biography, and she wrote a small biography for the government of India, but then she opened up that work and actually did something quite amazing. She created a blog in the English language where she dedicated space both to talking about his biography and his works in English, so that might disseminate, as widely as possible, and even reach people who might not know a lot about the poet, other Indians as well as an international audience. And so she felt that Bharati had to be brought into the technological era, and that the youth, as well as everyone else, should be given an opportunity to learn the truth about him through whatever means were available. So that's a sampling of some of what she did.
Yeah, very, very, very important work, and the level of commitment and the passion, but also dedicating a lot of time to do this is phenomenal. I think sometimes we tend to do superficial things, and because sometimes the deeper part of a personality, particularly somebody like Bharatiyar. And one of the reasons also, I think, even though the period was under colonial government, his writing was far ahead of the time, and a lot of people at that time may not have appreciated how what kind of a vision that he was portraying at that time. And today, a lot more appreciation comes in, because many of the things that even the Western communities are now putting forward as ideas and concepts were far ahead in his way of thinking around some of those things, some of the themes around women's rights, caste, even romance and relationships. And I think one of the reasons I think your work has been also important is that you have kind of after generations, you're also looking at it from a multimedia point of view, and also looking at sharing beyond the literary part more about his life. So you are continuing that tradition within your family, to continue to document his work, his story. Tell us a bit about the work that you are engaged in, Professor Mira.
Yeah, definitely. So, my mother had kept me involved in everything that she was doing because, as you rightly point out, this is part of our family tradition. And she knew that after her time, someone would have to take care of her efforts, number one, and secondly, continue to propagate them, and to do that, as you say, very rightly, in the world as it is changing. And I absolutely think your remark about Bharati being ahead of his time is so important in that regard, because my mother felt that, of course, Bharatiyar had enjoyed great fame and respect and so on, but he hasn't fully come into his own yet for the very reason that you identified. Because he was so far ahead. He's still far ahead, and we are almost a century after his death now. So she felt that the future belongs to Bharatiyar. So she wanted to make sure that somebody would be there in the family to help to continue. And so obviously for me, being born in Canada, and I have a certain type of training and so on, and she tried to harness all of that and make it part of the overall effort to establish the authenticity of his work and life story. So basically what I've done, I'd say my contribution so far has been focused in two areas. One has been actually to study the history surrounding the publication of his works. So that whole effort of establishing the authentic text, there I've been able to play a bit of a role, and particularly through a doctrine of law known as the moral rights of the author, which basically is a legal recognition of the idea that we should maintain the attribution of important texts to the correct author, and second, preserve those texts in their integral form. So my mother actually adopted the attribution and integrity interests as the rationale for her edition of the poet's works. And she said this is a very clear thinking way to look at this, what we're trying to do here. And so that was an area in which I contributed. And of course, I've also written about the history and the legal aspects of all that, which is very interesting, but a bit more specialized. But a second area in which I've been very involved is in bringing the poet to an international audience, and in particular doing so primarily through the English language. And one of the very exciting projects that I've undertaken is to edit Bharati's own original writings in the English language. And in fact, it's perhaps not widely known today that he wrote quite a lot actually in English. And he did that not only for the purpose of publication in journals and so on, but his personal purposes as well. He actually kept a journal of his thoughts, as he called it, in English, which is a remarkable document and reveals all the hallmarks of Bharati's personality as we know it through his Tamil writings, but in a completely different medium. And so one of the efforts that we have been wanting to make is to bring those English writings before a broader audience, in India and the world, people who may not have access to the Tamil writings, but who can get a very clear picture of the poet, who he was and what he was all about through reading those writings. So that's actually the next project that I have in mind, is to bring out his English writings, which I hope to do early in 2021 in a new edition, and thereby help to open up Bharati to a broader audience in the 21st century.
So you, I don't know if I remember hearing that when your mother came to Canada, were they in Ontario as well, in Toronto initially?
Yes, absolutely. So actually, initially they came to Vancouver, and in fact, the reason was so that my father could study at Simon Fraser, which was then a new university. So he was part of the first graduating class for his master's at Simon Fraser. But later on, they came to Toronto and settled there for a number of years. They were there on and off between 1988 and about 2002, 2003. So we have a deep acquaintance with the city, and I spent my teenage years there. So definitely there's a strong connection.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think this is the beauty of this conversation that we are having, is tying in a bit of a connection to the diaspora community. And that's why I want to ask you a bit about, now that the 100th year anniversary of his death is coming up, and the diaspora communities are preparing to honor his legacy. And one of the things we feel is that, it'll be a very powerful tribute if, after 100 years, we are looking at the level of appreciation being much, much higher than when it was 100 years ago for multiple reasons, including political, reasons, as well as his progressive nature that was underappreciated in multiple ways. So as a community, we are hoping that that tribute thousands of miles away from where he was making those impact would be a great thing to do. And so any ideas, tips, or any kind of suggestions as to how you think the diaspora could remember him after 100 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my general comment is that the most important thing we can do to celebrate him after 100 years is to read him and, to read his work, because as you say quite rightly, it speaks to us today, maybe even more powerfully than it did in the day when it was written, if such a thing is possible. So engaging with the works directly is something that we should all be encouraged to do and excited to do. And it's a very important part of preserving the legacy, because I think just about any writer writes to be read. The minute we stop reading the writing, the minute we stop engaging in a direct dialogue with the author, the work starts to die out. So it's fine. I know a lot about my great-grandfather. I'm delighted to be able to sit here and tell you about him. But there's one even better way to find out about him, which is to go directly to his own text. And I think many of the things that you mentioned when we were just having the introductory part of this interview, where you talked about the inspiration that his work is providing to today's creators, and that seems to me to be a most appropriate way to celebrate him. Take his texts, read them, make public readings, make private readings, learn the music. Now, one of the things my mother and I are hoping to do is to make Bharati's original versions of his poems as he sang them available to a broader public. So to learn those, to sing them, to develop compositions, to develop dance performances, to celebrate everything. And that too, not only in the artistic and cultural circles, but also in the scholarly circles, the historical circles, sociological, because his work was so broad-based. There was no aspect of human life and society that he didn't write about. And he had visionary, original ideas on everything that he touched. And so engaging with this writer, finding ways to create new works, finding ways to celebrate, even in one's own life, because I think one of the key things about Bharati that we must remember is he wrote about revolutionary change, but he didn't just write about it. He actually put it into practice in his own life. And in fact, the chief objects of that experiment were his own family members. So, his wife, his two daughters, they were the ones who carried out his experiments on feminism. His wife used to welcome visitors to the house, present them with water to wash their feet and so on. Today, it seems like nothing, but in those days, women of the house simply wouldn't do that. They would be enclosed in the interior. They wouldn't come out and see visitors, see men, look at them directly in the eyes and, establish their identity in such a way. But he actually carried this out in his house. And they were the willing participants in that experiment. So carrying forward his ideas in our daily life, that itself is an important form of celebration, I think, and would have made the poet happier than anything.
Yeah. And I think, as you mentioned, his literary work, what he wrote about was what he lived.
Yes.
As a revolutionary, as a freedom seeker, freedom fighter, as a journalist, as a social reformer. There's a multiple dimensions, but they're all connected. It was not like siloed in any ways. They flew smoothly into each of his dimensions, and I think that's why the complete personality was, within his work was so evident, and there was, and I think that's part of the reason. In addition to the fact that his work was powerful, the way he lived and the way he connected to his work himself was powerful. So it was not like seen as an artistic creation, but more of his reflection of how he saw the world being created into concepts. And so I want to ask you this before I go to the next one. Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to comment because what you said was so apt. I just want to add a comment there. He actually wrote, he said, the one who writes poetry is not a poet. The one whose poetry is his life and whose life is his poetry, that one is a poet. So that's how he lived.
Yeah, and I think that's key, and that level of connectedness to the work can go a long way. And that's exactly why, within 40 years of his life, that his work is continuing to be inspiring people today. So let's talk a little bit about your connection to the work. And are there pieces of his work that you particularly, I know it's hard to pick, but is there pieces of his work or themes or genres or any kind of particular part of his life that connects well with you more?
Yeah, absolutely. It is very hard to pick. But maybe I can say that, people generally are very familiar with his national poems, which is completely understandable because he was in many ways the chief poet, or even you could say chief propagandist in a popular sense, in a positive sense, for the national movement, definitely in South India. And his national poems are of course, absolutely wonderful. But for me, I'm fascinated by the broader reaches of his poetry. And I think that his philosophical writings in particular, to me, are absolutely remarkable because the way that he was able to engage with an existing tradition of Sanskrit philosophy as well as Tamil writing, and then to bring that into a modern voice is simply amazing, and has the effect of connecting the reader somehow with the very ancient traditions of thinking, literature, and ways of life, and giving them a new birth, if you like, in the modern context. So for me, some of my favorite works of his would be like the Karnan Pattu, this songs of Krishna, of course, where he imagined or visualized, I should say, Krishna in each important human relationship. So he wrote about God as the wife, as the children, as the servant, and so on, in this absolute remarkable series of poems. And another one that I love very much used to be known under the title of Vashanakavi, the prose poem, but actually the true title for it, the poet's own title, is Kachi, vision. And there I would say he had almost created a modern Veda, where he was inspired by the poems of the Veda Rishis, and then he wrote exploratory poems explaining about nature and the elements and how they interacted with the various experiences of life and death, of thought and of perception, and so on. Absolutely marvelous work. So those two would probably be among my favorites. Part of the reason I say that, no doubt, is because I had the inestimable privilege of reading and studying those works with my mother, and therefore had the benefit of her explaining them to me as well. So they have a special place in my heart.
Yeah. There's lots and lots of work by Bharathiyar that still has to reach people in multiple ways, and we have always started connecting to one aspect of his work, particularly because of where we are in our position already. But there's multiple work that we can explore and learn from. So as you said, the 100th year legacy could be to get into reading more of his work and connecting to those work that he's had and published. And we will share some of the work that your mother had been doing as well through links and other details where they can find some of those texts. But I want to finish off with saying that we will have multiple times where we can continue to have this conversation, because each of these questions are possibly like an hour conversation. So thank you for making it, I made your life hard by trying to ask you to keep it within a certain time. But we're hoping that this is going to be an ongoing conversation in some ways to explore this together during the 100th year. But I want to ask your input about, or even your views on this idea that we have, Tamil Civic Action have, to have a park in Scarborough, which has one of the highest concentration of Tamils in Canada. There's a park right beside two elementary schools that are located right beside that park, and we want to have that park named Bharathi Park, and to be able to honor his legacy, honor his work, but also to inspire, more importantly, another generation of folks. So your take, and I know you had provided support for this initiative earlier, and I wanted to get your views on it.
Yes, I think this is an absolutely remarkable initiative, and the timing of it couldn't be more appropriate, in my opinion. Bharati himself said that it was very important to celebrate anniversaries, like the birth anniversary, death anniversary of people from the past that we want to remember. And so in that sense, the anniversary is coming up. And at the same time, look at the world we're living in today, where there's such an overwhelming sense of the injustices and the inequities. And it's just reached a point where it's become intolerable for people. And it's very easy to understand why that's the case. One simply has to look around to see why. And, we see monuments coming down all over, not only all over Canada, but all over the world, all over the United States, where I am now. People no longer know who to turn to for leadership, for vision. They no longer know what is the history that they should be learning about and that they should be trying to keep alive in their own lives and pass on to their children and so on. So we need heroes. And we need visionaries who can take us forward into the future. At this time, I think more than ever before. And I can't think of anyone that I know of, either from Tamil culture or from any other culture that I've been acquainted with, and that is no small number. I can't think of another person who is more appropriate to put forward as an important person to memorialize today. And for that to be in Canada, in Toronto and Scarborough, again, couldn't be more appropriate. Because as we've been discussing, Bharati was a great reformer, a great revolutionary. He wanted to create an ideal world, as many great poets do. And his idealism was a world where there wouldn't be injustice, where there would be equality, where there would be a sense of brotherhood, of common purpose, and a world based on the values of love and compassion for one's fellow man, in fact, for all living beings, as well as one's fellow humans. And the ideas of equality and diversity that he put forward in his poems, he paid dearly for those. He was ostracized by his own community, but those were the values that he wrote about and that he lived by and that brought him happiness. And I think that as Canadians, these are the kinds of values that we pride ourselves on. We pride ourselves as being a sea of sanity in the world, a location of sanity, a location of diversity, a place where we're fighting for equality of all of our citizens, of all people who come to our country, even though that's not an easy task. Obviously there's a long way to go. So the fit, if you like, between Bharati's visionary leadership in these areas and Canadian aspirations, and definitely the city of Toronto, which is said to be the most diverse city in the world, if I'm not mistaken, by the United Nations. All of the factors come together perfectly. So what an appropriate, remarkable thing that at this moment in time, you want to set up Bharati as a person to remember, a person of note in a Scarborough Park. And it just seems like such a wonderful initiative.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I think, like you said, our generation of young leaders and our students and children and youth are looking for inspiration and looking for a way to connect all of these things that are happening around them in a way that they can drive forward as a generation that is filled with optimism and hope, but also is willing to put the time and effort to make that happen. And one of those things when you talk about Bharati's work is not just about hoping for something good, but also living a way in which you can reach that good. So it's a vision, but vision filled with a lot of practical ways of challenging those things to get to the vision that one aspires to. And in addition to that, we've been talking a lot about Canada being all of those things that you said, still has curriculum and things that are still Eurocentric. And here's a way to look at it from a framework of contributions and values that Canada still relates to, but from a person who doesn't come from a Eurocentric origins. Would be impactful to all racialized communities as well, not just Tamil communities, people who come from, but also people who are non-racialized. So I think we are hoping that impact will be there. Yeah.
And if I can jump in there for just a minute, I think that point can't be emphasized too much because, in the past, perhaps we've thought of Bharati as being a Tamil writer or an Indian writer, but I think in a way that's such a misunderstanding of the scope of his ambition. Because he wanted to give something to humanity. And what he gave to humanity represented the culture that he knew and loved best. the culture of Tamil Nadu, of Tamil language, and of India. But definitely his gift was for humanity as a whole. And, and he was able to reach people through the Tamil language, through his English writings, through so many means, through the fact that you and I are sitting here right now discussing him and his work. So his gift was for humanity as a whole. And that, I think, is the challenge of the future, is to make sure that that gift gets delivered to the people that it was intended for, people everywhere.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mira Sundarajan, for joining and connecting with us on this important topic. And as we mentioned, there's lots of things to discuss about Bharathiyar, and we will follow up with many conversations. And I think next year will be an exciting year of optimism, hope, but also a lot of reading. I think the habit of reading is going away from our younger generation, and maybe what we can do is inspire them to read through his work. That will definitely, I have no doubt, will connect, if not already they have connected to it. So thank you again for taking the time to be with us, and I'm really honored to speak to you, both because of the work that you're doing, but also because of your heritage as a great granddaughter of Bharathiyar. And we look forward to connecting with you back again in a few weeks or couple of months down the road. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Take care. Bye for now.